Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry Murray.
And I'm Jonna Johnson.
Help yourself to a gold medal class virtual donut as we run the 100-meter dash through this week's tech news. We're going to discuss the Google monopoly, Microsoft shooting down Dell's query about recompense, new security offerings from HPE Aruba Networking, and more. We're sponsored today by 1Password Extended Access Management. Bring all your unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under control. 1Password Extended Access Management ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management is available now to companies with Okta and coming later this year to Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. You can check it out at onepassword.com/XAM. That's the number one, password.com/XAM. And before we get to the news, just a reminder, we've got other shows on the Packet Pushers Network, including our security podcast, Packet Protector, and our newest show, Technically Leadership. This new show, Technically Leadership, is aimed at engineers and developers and other tech folks who may be thinking about moving into leadership or are already in some kind of leadership role. And I just want to get better at it. So you can find all of this on offer at packetpushers.net. All right, let's dive into the news. A federal judge has declared that Google has a monopoly on internet search. It's a victory for the U.S. Department of Justice, which brought the antitrust lawsuit back in 2020. The ruling cited facts such as Google's 90% share of the search market and the billions of dollars that Google pays to platforms like Apple, Samsung, Mozilla, and others to make Google the default search engine on phones and web browsers. Google, of course, says it will appeal the ruling. It's also not clear what the remedies might be, everything from Google being made to stop paying other platforms for its default position to actually breaking up the company. This process, I think, is going to take years. Jonna, you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I do. I mean, apparently, first of all, Google's counter-argument is that nobody's forcing users to default to its search engine just because it's bundled into a device. It obviously didn't sway the judge. I just want to give us a little bit of history and perspective. What happened the last time we did this? Back in the 1990s, Microsoft faced a similar finding when it was accused of illegally bundling its browser into its operating system and, in some cases, allowing software resellers to add any other browsers. You may recall then that the judges ordered a breakup of Microsoft. And if you're scratching your head trying to remember when that breakup happened, it didn't. Right. In 2001, the Department of Justice and Microsoft kind of said, oh, never mind, we'll just settle it here. And essentially, the main settlement was requiring Microsoft to publish its APIs. And I'm bringing this up simply because, historically speaking, it's highly unlikely that Google will actually need to be broken up. More likely, the case will get overturned on appeal. You mentioned there's plenty of appeals left. In fact, there's at least 3 rounds, the potential appeals to the U.S. Court of Appeals, District of Columbia Circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court. So they got a long way to go. But my take on this is a real warning flag to Google that its days of relying on search advertising for its revenue stream may be numbered. Just about 80%, I think last I checked, it was 77% of Google's revenue comes from search right now. Right. And that's under a 2-pronged attack. On the one side, you've got the AI folks who are trying to make AI the default quote-unquote search engine, just basically displace search entirely as a concept. And then on the other end, you've got the regulatory legal attack. Now, Google can respond basically one of 2 ways. They can throw a ton of money into trying to maintain their search dominance and fighting off the lawyers and fighting the legal battles, and I'm sure they will do that. But yes, they can either just do that, or they can turn around and say, we've got 20% of our revenue comes from actually selling products to customers. Maybe we could double down on that and start to grow that as an additional hedge against losing both battles to AI and to the lawyers. And my hope is that they do. It's immaterial what my hope is, but if you are an IT person looking at this, that's something to keep an eye on, because Google may suddenly make it a whole lot more cost-effective to use Google Cloud or the Google Office Suite or all of those other things, and it may be worth looking at those at this point if Google has made that strategic decision to double down on actually selling products to customers. I don't know that they will, but they could.
Yeah. Are you talking about enterprise customers or consumer or both? Are you suggesting Google go after customers. Microsoft? Okay.
Well, I'm not suggesting that they necessarily go after Microsoft, because they already are, competing with Microsoft in the cloud space, for example. And in fact, they will, Gmail is starting to become very popular in enterprise organizations, not as Gmail, but obviously rebranded. Right. Back in the early days, 10 years ago, people were terrified about using Gmail because entire business model was to search everything that you entered, to mine all of your data, to use it for selling eyeballs to advertisers. It appears that Google has kind of overcome that early resistance, and it does have a suite of enterprise enterprise grade solutions in terms of its replacements for Office, its replacements for mail. It's starting to put together a decent replacement for Teams. So we'll see. It may become an alternative is really all I'm saying.
I think that's interesting. My initial take is that it won't happen. One, Google has a long history of launching products and then killing them because they're not immediately successful. Two, companies that have most of their revenue coming from one source tend to focus all their energy on protecting that source as opposed to diversifying. Maybe Google's better than that at falling into that trap. I don't know. And three, obviously Google is starting to compete in this AI, I'm using air quotes here, AI enhanced search, because oftentimes it's really not that enhanced, but I do think they see where the puck is going and they're trying to skate toward it. So yeah, I guess my feeling is what Google is going to do is keep business as usual and just fight this in court as hard and long as they can.
They may. And honestly, I'm not really taking a position one way or the other. I'm just gaming it out. And what I would suggest if you're an IT person listening to this is keep an eye out to see whether Drew or I are correct, if there are, if Google looks like it's changing its strategy. I will point out, though, that some companies are actually extremely good at changing their business models and pivoting. And I will single out Microsoft as somebody who has survived every single major technology shift. So if Google's at all smart, they're gonna follow in Microsoft's footsteps on that in that area, and really learn to be resilient and refocus and everything else. Yes, and yes, they do. They are fighting on the AI front, and that's I brought that up, but. The thing is, if AI really succeeds in pulling eyeballs away from search, it doesn't matter whether you're doing AI-enhanced search or AI plain. It just means people are going to be using AI instead of search. I think that's a bad thing, by the way, for a whole lot of reasons, but that's not
a different conversation.
For here, yes.
And frankly, I would love it if Google decided to pull up its pants and go after Microsoft in the enterprise. I think it would be great to actually have some real robust competition there. I don't think they have the stomach for it, but maybe.
You never know. And yeah, exactly. It's hard work, so it's always safe to bet on companies and people being lazy. So there you go. Moving right along, we mentioned in an earlier episode that the EU and the UK were halting, well, not halting, but sort of throwing potential roadblocks in the way of HPE's $14 billion acquisition of Juniper Networks. They both caved. They both said, oh, never mind. Everything's fine. It can proceed. The EU said it's not going to reduce competition in the wireless LAN campus or data center switching markets. The UK sort of stopped slightly short of that and said, well, we don't think it's going to, but we'll be taking feedback from people until I think, for the next little while. But net, I think it's looking more and more like this merger is actually going to go through, which is great because we're continually reporting on very interesting upgrades and enhancements that are happening to Juniper, to HP, and ultimately to the merged entity. Any thoughts on that, Drew?
Yeah, my thought was that I didn't think this would be a significant regulatory hurdle because to my mind, the only place where you could potentially worry about anti-competitive advantage would be in wireless LAN. And when you compare HPE and Juniper's combined market share together, it still pales in comparison to what Cisco has in the market. I think Cisco has, I can't remember the numbers I last saw from Dell'Oro, but it's like 40 or 50 or a huge number, whereas HPE and Juniper combined is somewhere around 15 to 18%. So it would be hard to say, that's going to be a competitive disadvantage to customers in the market. I don't think so. So I'm not surprised this has gone through. And I think the US will be the last hurdle they really need to worry about.
And so basically that's Drew saying, I was right, neener. Because actually, I believe this was one of the last episodes Greg was on, and we were all sort of arguing it. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, yes, I agree. It looks like this is going to be smooth sailing from here on out. The U.S. may feel the need to throw some problems in there, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Honestly, my only feeling is that the one thing that can derail this acquisition is HPE and Juniper themselves, right? If they don't handle this transition and the management and so on, and all of the overlap in the product portfolio and make it make sense to customers, that's what's going to derail this, not regulators.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there.
And we will definitely be keeping an eye on that. So last week we discussed how Delta was toying with a lawsuit against Microsoft and CrowdStrike in an effort to recoup Delta's claimed $500 million in losses from the outage. If you were wondering about the possibility of an amicable settlement between corporate titans, that possibility is zero. According to the Register, Microsoft's counsel sent a letter to Delta saying Microsoft repeatedly offered to help Delta recover, and Delta rebuffed those offers. The letter also stated, quote, "Our preliminary review suggests that Delta, unlike its competitors, apparently has not modernized its IT infrastructure either for the benefit of its customers or for its pilots and flight attendants," end quote. So Microsoft basically telling Delta, your IT sucks, that's not on us.
Yeah, or as you pointed out, basically that's what you'd expect from Microsoft Legal. They'll litigate to hell and back before admitting any responsibility. Yes. And yeah, I mean, I think it's par for the course, and that's pretty much what vendors do. In fairness, I have to say, I love to bash Microsoft, and I do think they are much more at fault than people are giving them credit for, and we can go debate that offline. But it is true that Delta really staggered compared to everybody else. Now, I might point out that some of the everybody else has actually had some max cough, but that has nothing really to do, because I think people really did have processes that were significantly better. As I said, I was flying on, I want to say, United, and I was actually stunned that United was able to go from a dead stop to my flight leaves a few hours late, that quickly. And I was incredibly impressed with their ability to do the recovery. So whatever their processes are, they're working, and Delta's weren't. So Microsoft is correct on that front.
Yes. So it remains to be seen if Delta decides to pursue this. And if they do, we will keep you updated. But we'll move on with another story. HPE Aruba Networking has added 2 new security capabilities to its portfolio. First is a behavioral-based analytics NDR, or network detection and response. This is for IoT devices. So essentially, Aruba gear, including their APs, their switches, and their gateways, will collect and send data about IoT devices on the network to Aruba Central, to a data lake that Aruba Central has in the cloud. And then AI models will analyze this data to look for unusual or anomalous behavior that might indicate an attack or compromise. And that data includes the IoT device location, ports and protocols in use, SSIDs they're connected to, traffic destinations, traffic volumes, and application types. HPE says customers can also look at IoT traffic to see if any policies are being compromised.
Yeah, and I think this is actually very interesting, because what it underscores is that HPE's strategy, and I agree with the strategy, is to integrate IoT with IT. And this is actually a much bigger problem than it sounds, because if you look at this, a lot of IoT is running over IP, as it should be. That's kind of how it's designed. But the systems themselves were developed separately. The management was developed separately. And so we've got 2 artificial silos in a lot of organizations, where there's the IT, which is really for the information back office stuff, and then there's IoT, which is front end manufacturing, everything else. And really, if they're all using IP, they should all be managed and protected from the same core platform. And that's really where HPE is going. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and my thought is the network is kind of the only way to do this, because lots of IoT devices, you can't put an endpoint agent on to add, monitoring or security capability. So you have to watch what's happening on the network to get a sense of what they're up to, and are they behaving in strange ways.
Exactly. Yes. And I guess I sort of eluded over that, because I think the network component being key, there are good reasons to do something at the endpoint level and good reasons to do something at the application level. None of those apply in the IoT universe. And in fact, as you said, the network is the only place to do it. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you said also that this comes from an acquisition that these guys made, that HPE made back in 2017, and that that the capability actually requires you to be using Aruba Networking Central, which is their wireless LAN implementation. I think that's correct, and I don't think that's I think that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, though, that so this capability does come from the acquisition of Nyara, which happened many, many years ago now. And if you look at the press release announcing it, Nyara is all about big data analytics. And it was just kind of amusing to me how big data analytics has now morphed into AI.
Yes, exactly. I know. It's funny, because most of the organizations, a side note, most of the companies that I work with that have really effective AI implementations and initiatives had a pre-existing big data implementation and initiative, and all they had to do was feed in all the they basically said, okay, here's our policy for how we use data. Here is how we build a use case. Here's how we compute ROI, and we'll just apply that to AI, and we're off to the races, which is actually quite funny.
Yeah. The second enhancement that HPE Aruba is announcing is they now let you enforce cloud-based ZTNA access policies on-prem. So in other words, if you've set up access policies for users and devices that you've deployed in HPE's SSE or Secure Service Edge for things like remote users or branch office users, you can now enforce those same policies on the corporate LAN. To do this, HPE requires you to set up a VM on the LAN and in the LAN or in front of data center assets to serve as the policy enforcement gateway. The VM contains the same access policies as you've set in the SSE in the cloud. And this means you don't have to hairpin traffic from the LAN out to the cloud for policy checks and then back to the LAN. Both of these capabilities, this ZTNA enforcement and the new IoT NDR, as you mentioned, John, require Aruba Networking Central on Central's HPE's cloud-based WLAN implementation. My understanding is that Central users are a small percentage of Aruba's customers. Most are managing their WLAN on-prem. So HPE is trying to get folks to move into Central, and they do say that revenue from Central is growing fast.
Yeah, I would just add to this that effectively ZTNA should be implemented this way. You should have one single set of policies for on-prem and remote. Part of my issues with some of the other architectural solutions such as SASE are that they don't necessarily require that. Some do, some don't. And more to the point, I think the thing that leaps out in this announcement is you do have to set up a VPN on the LAN, but it can be on the LAN or in front of the data center, not on the end device. So you're not forcing corporate users to use, to do anything on their end devices, which is actually very important.
Yeah. Let's pause for a brief message from sponsor 1Password. Imagine your company security is like a college campus quad. There's the well-maintained brick paths between the buildings. Those are your company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there's the paths that people actually use, all the shortcuts through the grass, around fences, and behind buildings. Those are your unmanaged devices, your shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on the nice brick paths. A lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's available now to companies with Okta. It's coming later this year to Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. You can check out onepassword.com/XAM. That's onepassword.com/XAM. We thank them for being a sponsor. Moving on with more company news, Fortinet has acquired a data loss prevention company, NextDLP, for an undisclosed amount. Fortinet says it will integrate NextDLP into its Secure Service Edge or SSE offering. NextDLP has both an agent-based and cloud-based offering. And in parsing the Fortinet press release, it sounds like Fortinet is going to go with both. I'm not sure if Fortinet's going to try to integrate the NextDLP agent into its FortiClient endpoint software or just leave it as a standalone agent. And Johnny, you did some digging around about NextDLP.
Yeah, and I actually want to open something up to our listeners because from what I understand, NextDLP has been running kind of under the radar a bit. Apparently they were part of a company called Ava Security, the lion's share of which was bought by Motorola a couple of years ago. And NextDLP ended up kind of an somewhat orphaned company, kind of wandering around in the big world. They're based in London. And some of the last news is that they actually started a U.S. Management team so that they could sort of go into the U.S. market. They are strictly, as I understand it, channel-based, and they certainly have great ratings from Gartner and some of the other folks. But what I'm not seeing is they have any particular unique or powerful technology in the DLP space. And I could be wrong. That is not an opinion. That's a statement. I'm not seeing it. So I'd ask our listeners, is there anybody out there who's using NextDLP? And is this, do you think this is really going to be an advantage to Fortinet? My assumption is Fortinet knows what it's doing. And Drew, I know you've got some thoughts on how this is an improvement on what Fortinet currently has. I'm just wondering how much of this is really an improvement, whether they're getting, they're bringing their software from below par to par, or whether there's something actually unique and special about what they're getting. So if there's anybody out there using NextDLP and loving it or hating it, please tell us. And, hit us up on the FU. We'll remind you again at the end of the episode.
Yeah, packetpushers.net/FU if you've got some insight. Yeah, I will say, reading between the lines, I'm not super familiar with Fortinet's DLP capabilities that are already had in-house before this acquisition, but it seems like it may have been sort of fairly static, essentially a database of predefined data patterns, so like social security numbers, credit card numbers, et cetera. So you can set up your basic policies to find and block the transfer of data that matches these patterns. NextDLP can do that, but it also includes user behavior monitoring, and it says it can detect things like an employee trying to move files from a SaaS business application to a personal drive and track user activity and data flows. So I'm guessing it's got more visibility into just sort of what users are up to with data, not specifically like we're just going to look for social security or credit card number. So it does seem like it's extending Fortinet's DLP capabilities, giving it a little bit more into the user behavior space, which to me does sound like it's additive for Fortinet.
It's absolutely additive for Fortinet. Yeah. I would just question whether because all of those capabilities are absolutely Mark 1 Mod 0 for any modern DLP. Yeah. So, my question is there anything else?
Is there more?
It's great that you can do dynamic behavior monitoring. It's great that you can, add intelligence to your monitoring. That's what DLP is supposed to have been doing since, roughly 2015. So is there anything special about the next DLP above and beyond that we're missing?
Well, I think the other thing is it was probably cheap. Next DLP reportedly raised only $10 million in funding. Fortinet didn't disclose the acquisition price, which makes me think it's not that material. So probably tens of millions to pick up this company. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, filling the gaps is not a bad strategy for a good company, and sure. Fortinet's a good company, relatively speaking, in terms of what it delivers and what it does. So just curious if anyone has any further insight.
Yeah, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU, and the FU is for follow-up. Okay, some more product news. Azure is rolling out a public preview of the Auxiliary Logs plan in its Azure Monitor service. The idea is to provide a single service that lets companies store logs in different tiers for different use cases. So for instance, logs required for compliance purposes can go into a cheaper tier, but then if you have logs that you're using for troubleshooting or investigation, they can be stored in a tier that supports more frequent access among concurrent users. And of course, it's going to cost you a little more. So you get options include auxiliary logs, basic logs, and analytics logs. Regardless of tier, Microsoft said the logs can be stored for up to 12 years and queried and searched. I looked at the pricing and the differences are significant. For 30 days of retention on the auxiliary log tier, you're looking at 10 cents per gigabyte. Basic tier is 50 cents per gigabyte. But if you want the analytics tier where you're going to be searching and looking at these logs more frequently, you're looking at $2.30 per gigabyte for 30 days of retention.
What I think is interesting about this is less the ability to do price arbitrage, which, as you point out, is important, and more that it's a good move because it forces enterprise users to sort of think about which logs go where and how they're going to be used, which is not a normal conversation that happens in most enterprises, because most people say, oh, back up the logs. And that's it's all one giant homogeneous glob. And I think it's important to be having that discussion now that you've got this pricing differential that's getting imposed that makes it cost effective to think about it. People are going to take the time to sit down and say, what do we need to store and why do we need to store it? And then have the conversation of how much do we want to pay to store it? And that conversation of what do we need to store and how are we going to use it and where should we store it is the important conversation. It's great that you can also save money too.
Yeah, I mean, it literally is putting a price on each log. Like, what is this log worth to you? So, yeah, I'd like to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps you do something you should have been doing for a long time, but now it's cost justifiable. We're going to take the time to figure this out.
Yes, exactly.
And wrapping up with our space networking, just a little bit of news that the FCC has withheld full approval from AST SpaceMobile's space-based cellular. Basically, they are a low Earth orbit cellular provider that is hoping to compete in some levels with Starlink, and the FCC kind of said, maybe not yet. They gave them only limited authority to operate the satellite network when it launches the first 5 satellites next month in September. The company can only use its radio spectrum for telemetry, tracking, and command, which means essentially to manage the satellites themselves, not to offer services. And it explicitly said, no, you cannot test the cellular system, and no, you cannot loft another 243 satellites until we have a better understanding of what's going on here. You have a better understanding, and then you can request that authority for those further tests. So essentially the news here is Starlink as a competitor, but it is being held back a little bit at the starting gate by the FCC for various reasons.
Yeah, I wonder if it does have something to do with the spectrum they're using, but I assume the FCC is worried about interference.
I think it may be interference, but it may also be reliability, because if you get linked into the cellular network, as we've seen in the recent past, you can cause all sorts of problems. So I'm curious, and I think their bigger concern was, they really wanted to withhold the permission to do the testing on the cellular system. So for whatever reason that the FCC held back, it's worth noting that nothing's going to happen as fast as the folks at AST SpaceMobile have hoped for, perhaps, but keep your eye on this space. Space networking is always fun.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting that obviously satellite-based internet is making its way into our lives, but I'm excited to see more development here on cellular-based internet, cellular-based satellite access, because you essentially get to use an unmodified cell phone and still get signal service from a satellite as opposed to a tower, which means one, more competition, and two, the ability to get service in areas that are typically underserved by the ground-based tower systems.
Well, and I would also say that's an excellent point, because the form factor matters. I'd say the other thing is you don't have to go out and buy a whole new thing. And I keep coming at this from the perspective of sailing. If you're out in the Atlantic Ocean, you don't have to go buy a whole special system and rig it. You can just use whatever you've got to be your hotspot. Yeah. I don't know how big an advantage that will be long term, because the lifespan of whatever your existing device is fairly small, and it's not much out of the realm of expectation that pretty soon you're going to start seeing dual mode or tri-mode devices that include low Earth orbit satellite on a couple of networks plus cellular that you can then activate should you wish. We'll get there. I mean, I know it sounds really wacky, but the capabilities of our current cell phones sounded pretty wacky back in 2010. So,
yeah, for sure. All right, that wraps up our show. Jonna, if folks want to reach out to you, where can they get you?
Hit me up on Nemertes.com. N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R-T like Thomas, E-S like Sam.com. That's where I live. Happy to respond if you reach out and try to contact me there.
All right. I'm Drew Conway Murray. I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Network Break. If you enjoy the show, we'd love it if you could leave a recommendation on Apple Podcasts or just share a link with a colleague. And as always, you can send us comments, corrections, or kudos at packetpushers.net/FU. We do take all follow-up seriously, so please do reach out. As always, thanks for listening.